Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Our guest in this episode is a politician, a scientist, an individual who also has a passion for business, the environment, and most importantly, his family. He has served a term in Ottawa as the Member of Parliament for Kingston and the Islands, and after a break, was recently elected as a member of the Ontario Provincial Parliament, representing the same constituency but working in Toronto. There are many facets to this man, so let's get to it. Joining me on the Kingstonian podcast is Ted Hsu. Welcome, Ted.
Dave, so great to be on your podcast.
Let's remind our audience that we are recording this episode in mid-November of 2022. So thanks again for participating in our podcast. And let's go back to the very beginning. When you first arrived in Kingston, I think you were about 6 months old, and your dad had just accepted a position at Queen's as a professor in the chemical engineering department at Queen's. You completed a physics degree at the university. Was science always something that you wanted to pursue?
Science was something I wanted to pursue since I was very little. It started with astronomy. When I was little, I would often borrow astronomy books from the library, and that was my start in science. And actually, when I think back, there's these fuzzy black and white photos of the stars and the planets, and it's really amazing what we can do nowadays.
Oh, with those satellites that they are launching and the cameras that they are sending back pictures are just incredible. Now, you went on to complete a PhD, and I think you finished in 1989, but you continued some postdoctoral studies, and you were working on math and computing and problem solving, leading to various business experiences involving some travel, going from Princeton in the States to Paris to Philadelphia to Tokyo. Talk about that particular time in your life.
Well, when I was in science, I was what they call a theoretician, which means I would make models of the systems that people were doing experiments on. And I made models of materials where there were a lot of electrons flowing through the material, and the electrons would interact with each other, and they would conspire to flow without any resistance. So you would be able to move a current through these materials without any loss of energy. These were called superconductors. And there was a class of superconductors discovered in the 1980s where you did not have to cool them down very far, and they were still superconducting. Normally, if you take lead or tin, you cool them down to almost 0 degrees Kelvin, they become superconducting. But these materials, you could just put them in liquid nitrogen and they would be superconducting. So other people would do experiments, and I would put together these models to try to agree with or predict the results of these experiments in order not to check the experiments, but to check the models more than anything. So we're trying to understand what was going on in these materials to allow the electrons to flow without any resistance. So I got pretty good at using computers and using mathematical models and looking at experimental data, real world data. And I used that in a transition later on into the business world. I had computing experience and math experience. And I got a job. I transitioned into the financial world. I was able to use that experience to model interest rates. And we had models of interest rates that we were trying to tune in order to match what we saw in the real world interest rates. So these are rates that you might borrow to get a mortgage on your house, or you might receive if you invest it for your retirement. All of these depend on interest rates. And so I worked on models of interest rates when I first moved into the business world. And I was able to use that transferable skill of mathematical modeling and number crunching with computers.
Now, did you ever take some of those models on interest rates and talk to the fellows at the Bank of Canada to talk about what they're doing right now with interest rates?
Well, no, no. So we certainly had to understand what the central banks were thinking on a general level, but what they would do would be an input into our models. So they would set a short-term interest rate, an overnight interest rate, and that would be an input into our models. But we never really got into the policy or commenting on what the central banks did, but we would use that as a given in our models.
What was the attraction in doing all that traveling at that time?
Well, I hadn't intended to do traveling, but I was traveling to where the jobs were. So because I was working in the financial world, there are just certain places in the world where there are financial centers. So around the New York area, around London, Paris, and then Tokyo for Asia. So I just went to where the jobs were, but it was a very fortunate experience in that I got to experience different cultures and just different ways of doing things. And I think that's enriched my life and helped me have a different perspective in what I'm doing now.
At the end of that particular period, given all the travel you were doing at that time and the different positions you occupied, what was your long-term career plan as you were thinking about it?
I don't know if I had my long-term career plan had always been to be a scientist, to do research in science, to try to understand the world around us. And but there weren't, there are only so many academic jobs. And so I took a job in business, and I wanted to use my skills and try to make better models than anybody else had ever modeled, or to use them in a way that made the best of the kinds of models that people were developing. So I didn't have any long-term career goals at that time. I was still young and just kind of going from one thing to the other and trying to do something different from what had happened before, and as best as I could.
Now you're back in Kingston, you're back home, you got involved with an organization called Switch. Can you talk about that particular group? What was it all about?
Yeah, I came back in Kingston, and that was a time when I got interested in climate change and sort of the big global long-term challenge that climate change is. And when we moved back to Kingston, I found that there was a local organization at that time, rather special. There weren't too many organizations like that. Switch was an association of people who were interested in sustainable energy, but it had a sort of technical and professional bent. So you had researchers, small companies, educational institutions, you had the local utility, you had very interested local residents who were interested in climate change and sustainable energy. We had speakers come in to talk about startup companies in the sustainable energy field. We talked about renewable energy technology. We talked about government policy to encourage people to try out renewable energy, to develop renewable energy. And so that association is something that I got involved in when I moved back to Kingston. I eventually became the executive director of Switch for about almost 4 years. And it's still around today. It's celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. It's a great group of like-minded people who trade ideas, trade constructive criticism, and sometimes you even get research partnerships or business partnerships. A lot of collaborations develop from Switch meetings.
Now, how did politics move to the forefront for you?
Well, politics moved to the forefront when I realized that there were things that you couldn't just do locally. So one of the things that renewable energy efforts ran up against was that you could always burn fossil fuels for free. You could always take advantage of cheap fossil fuels like burning coal. The pollution that you created, you didn't have to pay for it. Everybody else would pay for it. And so I realized that there was only so far you could get by working in a local organization and helping local efforts, local initiatives, local businesses, local researchers. You needed people to go and advocate for a global effort. So, for example, making sure that you can't pollute for free. Making sure that we moved away from coal-fired plants in Ontario. That was something that was able to be achieved, but only at the government level. And that's quite an accomplishment that Ontario made. And that's one of the things that pushed me into politics. I had the same push when I was raising my kids, because I would think about the fact that I could feed them, I could clothe them, I could read to them, try to teach them things, but there were bigger things in the world that I couldn't deal with just by helping them grow up day to day. I had to go and work on some bigger problems. And the big problems that we have today, the housing affordability crisis, the cost of living, healthcare capacity, climate change, all these things are something that you have to go out and help society as a whole tackle those things. And government is one of the ways that you can do that.
So you get elected in 2011, representing Kingston in Ottawa. What was your perception of that first week up in Ottawa as an MP?
It was unfortunately, it was a bad defeat for my party, the Liberal Party. So my first impression was I got up there and the whole party organization had fallen apart, because instantly a whole bunch of people lost their jobs. The staff members lost their jobs because the party had lost all the seats. And so I was trying to find people who could help me out. I had no place to put my things. And I remember one of the Liberal senators took pity on me and gave me a space in his office. And then I was able to get some other abandoned office space for about a week. It was a little bit surreal. I was not expecting to arrive in that situation, but I pretty soon I found my Liberal caucus mates and started to learn the ropes by just asking them questions about everything. And it turned out very soon to be a very friendly and welcoming and supportive group for a new MP.
Highlight of your time in Ottawa?
Well, the highlight is, I would say, two things. One, on a personal level, it was the camaraderie, the group of Liberal MPs that was very close because we were a small group. But we were very energetic and motivated, and we backed each other up. So that camaraderie is something I'll never forget. In terms of legislative work, the highlight, I think, would be my private member's bill to restore the long form census. And that bill, the long form census provides all the information about the state of the country that is essential in, for example, the public health response to the pandemic. And so promoting that bill, even though it didn't pass, I promoted that bill, had a nationwide campaign. And the first act of the newly elected government in 2015, the new Liberal government, was to restore the long-form census. So my campaign to restore the long-form census was the highlight.
You don't hear too much about private members' bills being approved. So that was a good accomplishment for you. You decided not to run for a second term. Why was that?
It wasn't right for the family. A lot of me wanted to run a second time, but my wife and I decided that our kids are only young once, but politics will always need good people. So I stepped back. I stayed involved in politics. I was a campaign manager a couple of times. I worked in different election campaigns. The mayor got me to chair his housing task force. I was involved in the ranked ballots referendum in Kingston. So I stayed involved, but just in the background. And when my kids grew up, I was able to run again in 2022.
Let's talk a little bit about that task force you just referred to that the mayor asked you to participate in on housing. That was back in 2019, so that's, 3 years ago. In light of what's going on now, how do you feel the work on that committee went?
Well, I think the recommendations that the report came out with are still very valid, and many cities have come up with similar recommendations. The Kingston Housing Task Force report has some Kingston flavor to it, but I think some of the main points are only now starting to be implemented, one of which is to build more modest middle market housing that people can afford, and to reduce the pressure on lower priced, more affordable housing. Another recommendation is that governments have to step in to build immediately deeply affordable housing, because it's very, very hard to build enough of that just from incentives of the private sector. It's just the economics don't work out. So many of the recommendations are still applicable, and I think that it's worth looking through that report to see what sort of things we should be working on next. There are a lot of ideas, co-housing and co-ops, reducing pressure on other sectors. Like right now, we have a big problem. People are doing renovations of houses. And one way that housing becomes less expensive is that it gets older. Mm-hmm. And we're not letting houses get older because there is such a shortage of supply that there's immense pressure to renovate and then rent it out or to somebody who wants to live in a renovated apartment. So, so many things that we could do. I think that report is still very relevant.
Now, you decided to get back into politics and you ran provincially in 2022 and you got elected. So your perceptions of your first week in Toronto as the member for the provincial parliament?
Well, if you thought the Liberal defeat in 2011 was bad, 2022 is much worse. The reason being that the Liberal caucus at Queen's Park does not have official party status. So we have 8 MPPs, but it used to be that you could be an official party with 8, but Mr. Ford changed that to 12. So we don't have official party status, but that's not just window dressing. It actually means that we don't have staff provided by the legislature. So if we were an official party, we would get about $2 million in funding from the legislature to hire staff for the leader's office, for the House Leader's Office, research staff, communication staff. So the NDP and the Conservatives each get millions of dollars to pay for staff that we don't get as an 8-member caucus. And so we kind of have to scramble to do everything ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we have to pool resources. But I think the main thing, again, is that the 8 Liberal MPPs came together. We gelled as a team very quickly. We're supporting each other, and our constituency offices are helping each other out. We can be very nimble. We don't have to talk to a lot of people to make decisions about what we're going to say or what stand we're going to take. So it's I feel very familiar in the legislature, sitting on the left, to the left of the speaker in the back corner. But there are no bad seats. You get time to speak, and you get an opportunity to bring up issues that are important to the province and to your own constituents. And so I'm very grateful to have that opportunity.
Now, as we record this, you have not been there all that long, but what sort of priorities do you have with respect to your time in Toronto?
Well, my priorities would be the things that we heard during the election campaign and the things that I said I would work on: housing and the cost of living, the healthcare capacity, climate change, the disruption to education and mental health and addictions. Those are the issues that came up over and over again. And those are my priorities here.
How important is dealing with climate change and the environment right now?
Well, we have lost a lot of time here in Ontario, and the situation is getting worse. The Earth is warming up. We can see already that there are many extreme weather events that are more likely than they otherwise would be. And there are people who study the science of Earth and the climate, and they can make these attributions. They can say, because the Earth has warmed up, this kind of flood or hurricane or a drought is 50% more likely. So we're already feeling the effects, and I think we owe it to young people who will have to grow up in a different world to act as thoughtfully and as quickly as we can to try to we only have a certain amount of resources, and we have to make thoughtful choices, but we have to move swiftly, and we owe it to our kids.
I had this discussion with a few other people, the issue of scientists and what they are telling people, and whether the people are believing what the scientists are telling them. And at one particular point, I think it was hard for scientists to get their point across. As a man of science, someone with a background in science, do you think it's easier for scientists now to get their point across to the general public about climate change?
I think that in Canada, in the last 10 years or so, the scientists have kind of woken up and realized that they need to do a better job of connecting with the public. Sorry, they need to do a better job of connecting with the public and communicating with the public and explaining what they do and trying to be accountable to the public who fund their research. So I think that that has improved in Canada. And I would say I've seen the same movement in the United States and in France. So I'm going to venture to say that scientists around the world have tried to make an effort to be better communicators. But I also think that we can see how the climate, the weather, extreme weather has come, and that's more in the public consciousness than it was 10 or 20 years ago. It's unfortunate that it has to come to that. But I think that has influenced public opinion. On the other hand, the pandemic and this high inflation that has hit us for the first time in several decades is, I will have to admit, it's distracting the public mind from the need to keep working on climate change. So there's a challenge there. It's not, it hasn't just gotten better.
What sorts of things can governments do to move that along, do you think?
Well, there are a lot of things, but maybe I could just focus on some things that we could do in Ontario. One thing that governments can do is to push the utilities to put in the infrastructure so that we can handle a lot of the things that are going to become electric. So cars are going to move to electric over the next 10 or 15 years. A lot of our heating and cooling is going to, well, the heating especially, instead of burning natural gas, we are going to slowly switch over to heat pumps, where we're going to be using electricity to heat our homes it's much more efficient than baseboard heating. We're going to slowly switch from natural gas fired hot water to heat pumps again. We're going to have electric vehicles that are going to be storing electricity and feeding it back into the grid when it's expensive during the peak times. So we need to have the infrastructure to handle all of this electricity that's going to be flowing in different directions. There's also going to be more solar panels on rooftops as the cost of that comes down. Mm-hmm. So the province can start now by instructing the utilities to start putting in the infrastructure It doesn't have to be overnight, but they can start now and learn how to do it efficiently and then roll it out at a lower cost over the next 10 years or so. But that's something that government needs to coordinate. The government is also, the federal and provincial governments are putting in money to, for example, convert steel furnaces from using coal to get rid of the oxygen from the iron ore to using hydrogen and electricity to pull the oxygen out of the iron ore. And this also uses a lot of electricity. So the province has to start thinking about where we're going to generate electricity. So we need to generate more renewable energy, try to see if we can purchase more electricity from Quebec or maybe in Manitoba in the far future. It's almost certain that nuclear energy will continue to be a part of our energy mix. And so I would just say the province needs to plan now and look far ahead, which it hasn't been doing in the last 4 years.
Let's talk about looking far ahead as it relates to you and your career. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Or do you think that far ahead?
I do think that far ahead. I see myself in Queen's Park. I am currently exploring running for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party. So I am currently talking to people to see how much support there is out there, putting together a team. And so that is a very large project. And hopefully in 10 years, there's the possibility that I could be the head of a government in Ontario. That would be a long-term goal. But there are many, many steps on that journey, and they haven't called a leadership contest yet. But when they do, there's a good chance I'll be in there. And I want to propose a vision for Ontario that is really fair, especially to young people who are got the short end of the stick right now. But an Ontario that's also competitive on the world scene, in the world economy, and is also climate ready, is really doing its best to do our part in the fight against climate change.
Well, I'm looking forward to what you and your passions bring to the table in this new chapter in your life. So I want to thank you very much for your time today. All the best.
Well, Dave, thank you very much for having on your podcast. I'm very impressed with the research you put into the questions, and I wish you all the best in future episodes of the podcast.
Well, thanks very much. Our guest in this episode, Ted Hsu, member of the Ontario Provincial Legislature for Kingston and the Islands. To those of you listening, thank you, and we'll talk soon.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.